The Prisoner's Dilemma is a classic study in game theory, looking at different choices people can make. It was only a matter of time before the greatest social political strategy game in the history of television decided to bring their own spin on the textbook dilemma.
It's a high-risk, high-reward situation. Although an extra vote would mean a lot later on in the game, I know it puts a big target on my head.
If you were unaware, the first episode of season 41 just dropped. Well, I guess if you are watching this video, you probably already knew that. With a new season and a new era of Survivor, means we also have new complex twists that'll be introduced into the game. New twists are great to keep the game feeling fresh and the viewers engaged 21 years after the very first season, Survivor Borneo. The issue with adding in complex mechanics into the game is that oftentimes it confuses a large portion of the fan base. The online Survivor community has been very confused about both the Prisoner's Dilemma twist and the shot in the dark game mechanic. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a closer look at the Prisoner's Dilemma and fully explaining everything that it has to offer in simple terms. We'll be breaking down this video into 4 separate sections to help us fully understand the interesting twist that JD, Xander, and Danny all took part in. We will first be discussing what the Prisoner's Dilemma really is and look at where it came from. Then we'll be breaking down how it played out on Survivor with our players, and then we'll be contrasting the difference between how the Prisoner's Dilemma usually works against how the Survivor producers decide to utilize it here. And then we'll close things out with discussing the pros and cons and what the best decision was for these players to make.
It's the Prisoner's Dilemma. You've just met these people, but you really don't know how they're going to respond to something that could benefit them personally.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. If you love Survivor, then this is the spot for you. Leading up to the first episode of Survivor Season 41, I posted daily Survivor videos, looking back at every single season in the show's history. If that's something that interests you, then I have a playlist containing all 40 of those videos, and you can find a link to that in the description. Additionally, we are on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and so if you want to help make that happen, it would be amazing if you could subscribe to the channel with the bell turned on so you never miss any of my Survivor videos. But hey, let's get right into discussing the Prisoner's Dilemma.
So that means it is a very fast pace.
The Prisoner's Dilemma is a scenario that people love to study that are interested in game theory. The original example is based on only having 2 different people, and it comes down to the idea of defecting or cooperating. Close your eyes and imagine this. 2 separate people get caught for a small crime. However, the police thinks one of them is part of a much bigger crime, and they need one confession in order to prove it. For this example, we'll pretend these 2 people are Rob and Russell, and the police separate them into 2 separate rooms. At the moment, they both need to serve 1 year in prison for the small crime they committed. This is where cooperating and defecting comes into play. If Rob decides to defect and say Russell committed the bigger crime, then Rob gets to go free. However, Russell will have to spend 3 years in prison instead of the initial 1 year. This is where things get really complicated, as Russell is also given the exact same decision. If both Rob and Russell decide to cooperate and stay silent, then they both need to serve the 1 year in prison. If they both decide to defect and betray each other, then they both must serve 2 years in prison. But what the best decision is ultimately comes down to thinking as a group or thinking as an individual. If Rob and Russell want to work together and think what's best for the group, then they'll both choose to stay silent and take the 1 year in prison. However, the issue is, as an individual, it feels better to defect. You will look at that diagram and see 0 years in prison and think defecting is the best option. At the same time, making the decision will end up hurting the group and ultimately yourself if the other individual has the same thought process and chooses to defect. The theory itself believes the rational thinker should always pick the option to defect, as people want what's best for themselves and don't want to be made a fool of. But in real world studies, this doesn't always end up being the case, as roughly 22% of individuals will choose to cooperate and stay silent even when they have no prior communication or connection to the other players. Overall, the dilemma points out certain situations where people end up hurting themselves when counterintuitively they are only thinking about themselves. So the question is, how does this break down on Survivor?
For today's duel, you're going to use sticks and rope to fashion a long pole.
It is now time to fully break down how the Prisoner's Dilemma played out on Survivor, so we can get a better understanding of the twist as a whole. And from the very beginning, it is obviously going to play out slightly differently than what the theoretical version dictates, as there is no prisoners on Survivor, and we have 3 individuals making the decision instead of the classic 2. The dilemma is shown on Survivor as choosing between risking your vote and protecting your vote. But before we get there, we have Danny, Xander, and JD all get separated from their tribes and head to the Survivor Summit. This in and of itself is played off in a super interesting way, way, as all three of these players get selected in different ways. Danny volunteers, Xander gets told to go, and JD ends up drawing the White Rock. They ultimately go on a massive hike where they're all able to get to know each other and then separate where they need to make a decision based on risk versus protect. And this is where we see a variation on the prisoner's dilemma. If everyone chooses to risk their vote, then everyone loses their vote. However, if one person chooses the protect option, then everyone else gets an extra vote that is valid until the final 6. Danny chooses to protect his vote, and Xander and JD decide to risk their vote. To make the twist even more interesting is the fact that all three of these players that participated decide to go back to their camps and tell their tribes different information. Danny is a street shooter and told his tribe the complete and honest truth. Xander told his tribe the truth as well, but how he described it was pure genius. In confessional, he described the twist to us the viewers as the prisoner's dilemma. However, back at camp, he decided to play it dumb and describe it as just a game of chicken. Ultimately, JD ends up looking the worst here, as he was the only one that ends up lying to his tribe, and everyone could see right through his deception.
And I don't believe he just said.
Right out of the gate, there is a clear-cut difference here between how the theoretical prisoner's dilemma is studied in game theory and how the Survivor producers decide to execute it here. And to help explain the difference, let's bring back our trusty diagram. There is always supposed to be 4 different outcomes that can take place when discussing the prisoner's dilemma. And actually, let's bring back Rob and Russell here as well to help get our point across. There's a scenario where Rob and Russell both stay silent. There's a scenario where Rob stays silent but Russell betrays. There's a scenario where Rob betrays but Russell stays silent. And the final scenario is where they both decide to betray each other. The key thing to notice here is that there's a punishment that takes place if both Rob and Russell decide to stay silent. The very best outcome you can get is to receive 0 years in prison. But if both individuals take the safe option for the group and decide to stay silent, then both individuals must serve 1 year in prison. When you flip this around to discuss the risk versus protect mechanic in Survivor 41, there's less outcomes that can take place, and at the same time more individuals taking part. In a what if scenario where all players chose to protect their vote, there would have been no consequence for choosing the safe option. There needed to be another variable involved to make this a true prisoner's dilemma. Hypothetically, there could have been an added bag of rice for everyone unless you decide to protect.
And there will be some controversial twists. They will have no food, they get no rice, and they get only minimal supplies to start with.
After really sitting on if protecting your vote or risking your vote was the better option, for a couple days now, I find myself leaning more towards the side of going in and risking your vote.
Don't go for the gusto, as Wendell Holland would say. You're gonna get your torch snuffed.
Getting yourself an advantage during the very beginning of Survivor that will last you until the final 6 is just way too powerful to pass up on when looking at it from a straightforward perspective. It also just so happens that all 3 players that needed to make the decision were strong, athletic guys. And when you start out with tribes of 6, you cannot afford to lose your physical players early on in the game. To help make the decision a little easier, conventionally in Survivor history, people like to look for the easy vote during the first couple of days in the game. And so these tribal councils often don't end up coming down to 1 vote. And so, if the worst case scenario happens and you lose your vote, as long as you are in a good position with your tribe, then you are still good to go. And that is just if you're looking at things from an individual sense. If you look at it from a group perspective, I think the decision becomes even more clear. Best case scenario, you are given an extra vote. In worst case scenario, you just prevented 2 other people from the opposing tribes from receiving an advantage in the game.
I don't think it's a big risk for me going home, but I don't want to lose the loyalty. I think those guys will probably protect their vote as well.
The prisoner's dilemma is a complex idea that is studied within the world of game theory, and I was super excited when I noticed Survivor decided to introduce it into the first episode of season 41. Although it was a slight variation from the conventional dilemma, I loved how the summit and risking your vote versus protecting your vote played out, and I'm so excited to see how JD and Xander decide to use their advantages in the future. Let me know in the comments down below if you would have chosen the protect option or would have gone with the risk instead. And of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel with the bell turned on so that you never miss Survivor content from me just like this.